Thank you, and good morning to all of you once again. And as I had promised at the beginning, that I will cover one topic in the morning, early morning, and the second one later. First of all, let me thank Kanchana from the Royal Thai government, who has been very instrumental in helping us steer the Asia-Pacific Sustainable Development Forum last year. And I think she summarized succinctly and offered the bridging between that and this platform. Also, I'd like to thank Thomas Gass, my colleague, when I was in New York, for giving us an overview of what is happening in New York, which is what influences also how we steer these processes. But ultimately, the ownership is with all of you, as I see from the region. So my first task is that I reiterate the point that the Asia-Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development is being convened at a time when the global intergovernmental negotiations on the post-2015 development agenda are at an absolutely advanced stages. We have worked hard over the last couple of years with all of you to sequence our regional consultations with the private sector, environmental authorities, and representatives of civil society, back to back with this forum this time round also. And what I'm going to say also include the perspectives of our colleagues from these different tracks. For this round of deliberations, there are actually two key focus issues that we have. One is responding to the request by member states at the 70th Commission session last year to provide guidance on approaches to balancing the integration of sustainable development. And number two, regional follow-up and review mechanisms. I addressed the latter in my opening statement this morning. So in this presentation, I will provide an overview of ESCAP's new theme study, which tackles a number of critical questions. So first, what sustainable development challenges are posed by the Asia-Pacific development context? You know it more than we, but let's just go over them very briefly. Two, how do we contextualize and operationalize the concept of integration of the three dimensions of sustainable development? Three, what institutional reforms and capacities are needed? And this draws on really your performance in the region. And fourth, how can regional cooperation support national progress to advance post-2015 agenda? I'd like to remind all of us that the post-2015 development agenda has at its core sustainable development and poverty eradication, and is being complemented and supported by a framework of goals, indicators, and targets. However, despite decades of consensus on the interdependence of the three dimensions of sustainable development, we have observed that there remains lack of clarity and sometimes little agreement on what balanced integration really means. So this particular slide in front of you tries to indicate that we do need integration of three dimensions of sustainability to be well understood amongst us. We want people to understand that the future we want calls for balanced integration. But what is balanced integration and how to implement it? I'm going to just give you in a snapshot what balanced integration is. The allocation of resources and investments that maximize synergies and minimizes trade-offs among the objectives of economic growth, social justice, and environmental protection for all stakeholders, not only just the current population, but worrying more about our future generation. So I hope that this study will allow policymakers to think through how to formulate a cohesive and coherent framework to ensure this balanced integration, and those who have achieved to share during their statements effectively how they are managing the process. As I promised, I think it's important that we go over some of the dynamics of our region. Balanced integration is pertinent for Asia Pacific. When the region, there is a big question, why is it important for our region when the region has achieved impressive economic growth and lifted millions of people out of poverty? So really, 5 elements are very important: widening income disparities and unequal opportunities, poorest households experience income decline, and poorest 20% of population now accounts for 10% of national income. Disparities linked to trends in jobless growth, unemployment, and the vulnerable workers. Economic growth in the region is based on high material throughput. Asia Pacific uses 3 times the resources compared to the rest of the world to produce 1 unit of GDP, even though per capita use of resources is low. So there is a big contradiction here. The region is affected by the increasing frequency, severity, and impact of climate change-related risks. More than 85% of people affected globally by disasters live in our region. Average number of disasters reported per year in the region has grown almost 4-fold since 1970, and economic losses over the same period increased 15 times, while region's GDP grew 5 times only. Environmental change is of a major concern, and I was delighted to have the UNEP Executive Secretary and myself be 2 days involved in the environmental issues. Most of all, land use change, biodiversity loss, the greenhouse gas emissions are among the key environmental issues impacting stock of natural capital. There's much more out there, but in interest of brevity, I am just touching upon these issues. So let me turn to what our Asia-Pacific partners have been telling us. We should finish the MDGs agenda as a priority. Indeed, there is a lot out there. The inclusive, resilient, and prosperous future we want for all the people of Asia-Pacific demands that we place sustainable development at the heart of the development agenda beyond 2015. Our record of MDG achievement shows agenda is unfinished. Health and gender goals are of particular concern. Middle-income countries are expected to achieve 13 of the 21 Millennium Development Goals targets, while low-income countries will achieve only 9, and the LDCs will reach only 8 targets. And if you go into specific countries, I have to say that the situation could be a little more concerning. More than 1.4 billion people still live on less than $2 a day. That has to be the benchmark for our region to really look at the less than $2 a day, not just the below that level. 1.7 billion lack access to improved sanitation, and 2 billion people lack access to adequate energy services. These persistent gaps must be addressed by the relationship between the co-evolving economic, social, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development, so that we can embark on a better success than what we have achieved so far. How member states close these gaps represent an important challenge indeed, but an opportunity for policy, and I'm sure our country delegates will share their own perspectives on how they'll go about it. So let me get on to the real core of our study: integration of the 3 dimensions. What does it do? It provides a conceptual framework to guide normative policy shifts, the main business of ESCAP, normative work. It suggests strategies and policy options, another important area that is our mandate. To highlight existing approaches from the region so that we can learn from each other. Third, identify the best institutional frameworks and capacities required, but also learn from what it is to have a deficient or an incomplete, uncoordinated institutional framework. And finally, propose opportunities for regional cooperation, which is the best mechanism and the mechanism that we provide in ESCAP to cross-fertilize. So fundamentals of conceptual framework is the next contribution of this paper that must have been distributed to you already. Sustainable development requires us to, one, stay within the biophysical carrying capacity of the planet. That's what the literature that's based on a lot of empirical evidence indicates. It's the scientists who are talking about it. It's the economists who are talking about it. It's virtually every field, intellectuals who have been researching in this area are saying today. Provide an adequate standard of living for all. The future generations, more important. Provide systems of governance that respect the basic needs of all and propagate the values by which people want to live. And I can tell you, in our conversation very early this morning, all the leaders that were present in the opening session underscored value. And value is the biggest asset of Asia and the Pacific region. Whether it is economic value, it's social value, both are our strengths. Let's harness this much more. The other point that I wanted to cover was that there are indeed interdependencies, interlinkages, and co-evolution among the three dimensions. That has been brought out by a lot of pieces of literature. Sometimes people tell me, what is all this? So many goals, so many targets, so many indicators. Of course, I'm also party to saying the same thing. But I have to say that if you actually examine that the goal for healthy lives is supplemented by targets related to environment, you see this interdependency very significantly. And I've talked about it in the UNEP conference, so my remarks there would also come in handy if you want to see some of the examples. And Achim Steiner talked about it too also this morning. Trade-offs across the three dimensions created by market imperfections and governance shortcomings. One of the people who I really admire, Joseph Stiglitz, who's very controversial and very provocative and liked by as many as he's disliked by, I have to say that in the financial markets literature, he talks about the market perfections. And he has a very good contribution to telling us how regulatory framework is critical to deal with the market imperfections. That's the role of the governments and the regulators. It's not the role of the governments as per se, but the regulators and the governance institution that ought to have the independence to really. And I was very pleased yesterday to meet the head of the Tribunal on Environment from India. And I think that is a unique institution to really have vigilance on what's happening to the forest, what's happening to the environmental degradation, and act decisively. And yesterday we had the Environmental Award ceremony here, where we saw firsthand witness the amount of work that private sector and our colleagues from customs, taxation authorities, agencies that perform vigilance on the drugs and others are all playing a very significant role to arrest the environmental degradation and penalizing where it has to be penalized. That is what we really need, and we will talk more about the governance and institutions later. The other point is the allocation of resources and investments, which has to really follow through and think through the synergies or the trade-off between the three dimensions. Let me move to the next slide, the normative shifts, policy shifts. So, the conceptual framework for the study offers guidance on need for 4 normative policy shifts. Establish social justice, not just one indicator, but get a comprehensive framework of social justice. Second, tied to it is ecological sustainability. That goes hand in hand, as they have to be fundamental drivers rather than peripheral policy objectives. Today, the finance ministers of countries really look at macroeconomic balances and growth. What is important for us to really make them understand that is social justice and ecological sustainability that they need to finance too. Recognize public expenditures for social and environmental sectors as investments with high payoffs over long-term time horizon. Third, resource efficiency and sustainability to be recognized as critical drivers of production and consumption to support quality and inclusive growth. Fourth, redefine notions of well-being, progress, and growth to go beyond GDP alone. These shifts can help governments to shape effective policy and institutional frameworks. We must ground our efforts in principle of social justice and human rights to achieve universality. Human rights is very important to the United Nations. That's what it stands for. This is an ambitious but critical aspiration. Success will not be easy given our binding constraints, including the finite natural resource base, planetary boundaries, and fiscal capacities, which render undoubtedly the task of avoiding trade-offs between growth, the well-being of people, and protection of planet. All forms of capital, human, manufactured, infrastructure, natural, social, and finance, contribute to social progress. Underinvestment in the critical forms of capital that are undervalued in market economies fails to recognize the interdependence of the elements of sustainable development and will have seriously negative impacts on intergenerational equity. Experience shows that investment in human and social capital through social protection interventions boost socio-economic progress. The high natural resource intensity that I talked about and the levels of waste and emissions across the region call for an enhanced action on resource efficiency. Need to better assess the impact of deployment of other forms of capital to be consistent with the broad thrust of sustainable development. This requires going beyond traditional measures of economic growth to valuing a wider range of physical and other parameters which has been talked about by the more recent economic literature. Let me now shift from the conceptual persuasive arguments to talking about the Regional Forum of Environment Ministers and Authorities. There was a purpose to having some back-to-back meetings, and this was a very instrumental meeting, thanks to UNEP, Mr. Achim Steiner. The first Asia-Pacific Forum of Ministers and Environment Authorities was held here over the past 2 days, representing 33 countries, half of our region. Much discussion focused on the role of environment in delivering these SDGs and opportunities provided by them. Meeting highlighted need for an integrated approach, recognizing that we cannot achieve sustainable development without consideration to people and planet. And it called for transformational changes to development strategies and plans. Some of the changes discussed were: 1, Strengthen integrated national institutional arrangements for SDG implementation, a topic which has been covered in the theme study very strongly. Raise awareness about SDGs among national, but more so also at the subnational level. In my own country, bulk of the responsibility of social and environmental oversight rests with the provincial and the local governments. 2, support mainstreaming of environment in financial and budget planning system in partnership with national stakeholders, but draw in the finance ministers, the central bank governors, the stock exchanges, and I'm proud to say that some of us have been able to do so. During our Asia-Pacific Financing for Development, we had about 40 ministers and central bank, finance ministers or deputies and central bank governors. This was unthinkable in the United Nations platform in the past. We just had a securities market and stock exchange regulatory meeting in Thailand, organized by UNCTAD and UNEP, and so forth. The final, but the most important, is the strengthening of the capacity in statistics and data management. The whole UN system is collectively working on achieving that. In some areas, we knew we need to measure, to have proper measures of certain indicators. In other areas, we need to really dump the inadequate estimates, and in other areas, we need to fine-tune our understanding of the data assessment and gaps, both regionally and nationally. Finally, but the most important one, which I talked about yesterday, and again, our notes would be available on our website, but we'd be happy to share with you, which is to ensure rule of law and enforcement of all laws, but most of all, environmental law. Let me move to another area in which we have had some contribution recently, which is much more than we've had in the past, which is the area, how do we really integrate the 3 dimensions effectively in the policy area? We need to adopt inclusive, equitable, and sustainable growth. Inclusive growth is better quality growth and calls for investment in human capital, justice, and economic productivity and dimensions. It places people at the center of the development agenda with goal of lowering inequality. It has to be done so in tandem with what some of you are already very familiar with, is promoting green growth. It's an area in which ESCAP has achieved some competence. It represents investment in natural capital for ecological sustainability and economic resilience. Green growth is about synergies between economic growth and environmental protection. I have to thank the Republic of Korea for supporting UN ESCAP very generously to promote green growth knowledge. Inclusive and green growth approaches should be pursued simultaneously and can reinforce each other. Promoting financial inclusion as a part of inclusiveness is critical. This is where central bank governors and finance ministers come. In parallel, we want the ministers of science, technology, and innovation, and I'm talking to quite a few of them, to create an enabling environment for SDI through financial diversification coming from the central bankers and innovation for long-term financing. Their chair summary on financing for development in Jakarta offers us recommendations such as using all alternate sources and windows for financing and promoting financial diversification and innovation to ensure FFD, the financing for development. Reforming market incentives will help direct investments to sustainable consumption and production. Leveraging funding through public finance and official development assistance, which is scarce. Of course, UN system is trying to push for raising the official development assistance. Reshaped incentives framework can tackle incomplete costing and short-term horizons, which dictate our growth paths today. China is leading the path by looking at long-term rather than short-term. In this context, we are particularly encouraged to note pioneering efforts of several countries to address fossil fuel subsidies. IMF estimates annual global cost of fuel subsidies at $5.3 trillion, which is a 6.5% of global GDP. Imagine if this is directed to social and ecological sustainability, what a difference it will make to our lives. Damaging effects on people and environment is being pervasive through this fuel subsidy. Not only is it not targeted, depending on national circumstances, inclusive and sustainable growth should initially be promoted in the policy domains, potentially highly transformative, those important for livelihoods with positive impacts on population and rates of resource use. I'm very proud to report that as a result of the work of my colleagues, today we have a new multidimensional inclusiveness index, which you will be able to see in our Asia-Pacific regional survey that we have conducted. It talks about what are the sub-elements of that inclusive index and what value it will bring to helping you out as a tool going forward. Let me now move to another area of deliberations in the last 2 days. We had, in parallel to the environmental ministers, the leaders of Asia-Pacific talking about the businesses. Primary responsibility for sustainable development is not just of the governments. It is private sector is vital, be it finance, be it sustainable development technologies or whatever. Governments, of course, have to lead reconciling public and private interests, coordinating policies in different domains, engaging diverse stakeholders, and monitoring progress and impacts. This was underlined at the Regional Conference on Aligning Corporate Sustainability with SDGs, organized by ESCAP with a number of development partners, including OECD, Global Reporting Initiative, ESCAP's Business Advisory Council, most of all, and Sustainable Business Network, which has been created to help us in this area. These are valuable platforms for concrete business action on sustainable development. Our job is not to just lecture to them, but to hear their point of view and to really tell them how the market should drive the innovation in sustainable development, because they have to lead the market. Most enterprises still operate in national economies with laws, standards, etc., set at the country level. Business community view is that SDGs should be cascaded from global to national level, absolutely. So you see messages, whether it's strategies, it's finance, it's corporate, everybody wants the national platform to be the driver, and needs that direct business involvement in operationalization of the goal. Corporates responsive with proper incentives, responsibility of the public sector, have the potential to deliver sustainability. Money available in private sector, which is abundant out there, but business still requires public funding in starting new initiatives to mitigate risk, is the voice of the private sector. Public funding necessary as a spark. Private sector can add more value and more fuel, is what they say. Innovative financing for sustainable development initiatives already exist, but need to be popularized and shared. Crowdfunding is out there. Islamic finance is in a big way. Malaysia has plans that Islamic finance will be almost 40% of the total finance out there. And Asia-Pacific have a lot of countries that have Islamic finance and Islamic products out there, which go hand in glove with the conventional finance. Concerns remain, referring particularly to the possible trade-offs between efficiency and sustainability. Sustainable Development Goal number 8 on growth, jobs, and decent work points out to the possible conflict between cost efficiency and providing more jobs. Depending on sector and level of technological advancements or the way technology is geared, replacing labor may undermine achievement of sustainable technologies, etc. This morning, I was reading a fascinating article which argues that technologies can actually generate jobs. It's just that these will be new types of jobs, so we need skill enhancement to promote that. So what's our solution? Harness technologies that can absorb the labor that is being replaced. Shift social protection funding from labor cost to resource cost by correcting price for resources and improving resource efficiency. Private sector want to share the responsibility to direct shareholders, the owners, and public to fulfill better standards for reporting practices need. Now, to do this in one slide, a rich discussion of 2 days is doing injustice, but their deliberations are on our website too. Most important is the other engagement we had is the stakeholder engagement. Asia-Pacific Civil Society Forum on Sustainable Development, which was held 16th to 18th May 2015. Stakeholder engagement is very critical for post-2015 development agenda. This time round, our agenda has been inclusive at the United Nations platform, both in New York and here. No actor can achieve these ambitious objectives that I have outlined alone, particularly the integration and the balance between the three Ds. Recognizing need for partnership, this week ESCAP had several engagements with civil society. 100 civil society representatives met to discuss themes to be addressed at this forum to strengthen civil society engagement in this round of Asia-Pacific dialogue. Asia-Pacific Civil Society Forum on Sustainable Development ended Monday with specific proposals for key agenda items of this forum. We are happy to note that Civil Society Forum was organized with a lot of stakeholders also, including the women who are dealing with law and development. So what is their recommendation? Adopting sustainability principles as central development paradigm, aligning national budgeting and finance with sustainable priorities, putting in place policies, laws, regulation, economic instruments that internalize externalities. Civil society also addressed urgent need to overcome segregation in development programs and interventions. All this is the same message that comes from every stakeholder that I've talked about. So to conclude, let me present the recommendations of our report. Inclusively developed national visions ought to reflect the three dimensions. Political will, required will, with highest level of ownership, strong political drive and accountability is an absolute essential. Move from short to long-term strategic planning and drive your sector strategies along the same lines. Coordinate institutions with clear mandates for high-level strategy and policy coordination. Another area of recommendations is governance and institutional reforms. Strengthen the capacity, including strengthen science policy interface, decision support and other tools for integrated analysis, institutional mechanisms for follow-up and review, which I've talked about this morning, and creating policy feedback loops. And finally, to facilitate adoption and review of SDGs, proper measurement and data, and our statistics division, along with our functional divisions, are working to help out in this area. So what will be our regional follow-up to achieve scale? We have in the report not only what you are doing in terms of your strategies, institutional mechanisms, which you can read up during your spare time to absorb the good examples, but we are saying let's get a regional roadmap out there. Asia-Pacific Sustainable Development Forum and sessions will bring in the real players to develop the regional platforms for developing and facilitating implementation. Regional economic integration is an opportunity for us, and you know ESCAP has this as one of its biggest objectives. Then we are talking about regional platforms for promoting integration and strengthen United Nations at regional level, and we do have a regional coordination mechanism where the whole United Nations group sits with us and works together. So, finally, conclusion, 2016 marks the implementation of Sustainable Development Agenda. Many good examples of national development strategies exist. They tell us about the bold policy innovations with a long-term vision. Let's get out there and duplicate that. But urgent need for greater levels of aspiration to move to more resource-efficient growth trajectory, able to meet needs of present and future generations within planetary boundaries that puts people at the center of development. Do not forget, nothing will be done without political will and commitment. I have tried to sum up a lot of literature here in a very simple manner, and the debates of the United Nations built into that. So the academic architecture has been blended with the policy architecture, blended with the United Nations. So this is much more complicated than what it sounds here, but let's get out and do what the simpler debates that we have presented here show the path for. Thank you so much for being here.